And we can get started right away. I'd like to invite the first panelists and the chair, Professor Chatterjee, Elizabeth Kolsky, and the other panelists to come to the table, and we can get started.
Shall we begin? So, welcome to the first session of the conference. The title of the first panel is Nation-State Geographies, Identities. 4 things there. I believe initially it was framed around the question of borders and defining borders, but we needn't stick to that question only, because there are many other things to talk about, and the panelists are all very distinguished researchers. Elizabeth Kolsky, who was one of our Columbia PhD students, now published a book. She is currently at Villanova University, so welcome back to Columbia. Yasmin Saikia, who is at the Arizona State University, a very distinguished historian of Assam, and Willem van Schendel, whom I think I've known for about 30 years now, something. He looks the same. Once again, a very distinguished historian who began work on agricultural laborers in Bangladesh. That's when I first met him. Since then, he's written on a large number of subjects having to do precisely with migration, borders on the eastern part of India, Bangladesh, Burma, that area. He's at the University of Amsterdam. So, Elizabeth, first, what are the time? No, so basically we will then stick to about, what, half an hour each? No, 20 minutes.
20 minutes each?
20 minutes each, and then we can have enough discussion. Okay, thank you.
About 2 weeks ago, on September 30th, I woke to the news that I had killed a man. Anwar al-Awlaki, who had been on the US government's killer capture list since April 2010, was traveling in northern Yemen when his car was barraged with Hellfire missiles fired by CIA-operated Predator drones. I don't work for the CIA, and I've never been to Yemen. Yet, as a citizen of a democracy whose political power supposedly derives from its people, I am deeply troubled by this act of murder committed in my name, if not actually by my hand. Critics of Awlaki's killing have raised constitutional questions about the legality of a targeted assassination of an American citizen without due process. A recent New York Times opinion piece by Harvard law professor Jack Goldsmith brushed such concerns aside by asserting that due process, quote, depends on context. According to Goldsmith, the Obama administration acted justly by killing an individual who threatened American security outside the traditional battlefield. This argument is a logical extension of the Bush administration's position on unlawful enemy combatants, people unilaterally defined by the US government as beings beyond the reach and protections of international law. I am not terribly interested in the constitutional question regarding the rights of American citizens, as I believe that wanton murder is never a legitimate means to pursue justice. What I am more interested in is how ideas about space figure in modern legal regimes, and how speech acts enable legal acts, that is, how describing people in certain sorts of language defines what can and will be done to them under the law. Awlaki was not just physically outside of US territory when he was killed, he was conceptually identified as a subject who stood outside law. How can the state's application of law depend on, quote, context, when the rule of law is meant to be a defining feature of the modern state? What are we to make of these instances when the brute violence of the modern state becomes so starkly visible? Are these extraordinary moments, or do such summary killings reveal something fundamental about the violent and authoritarian core of the modern state? As our esteemed moderator Partha Chatterjee has demonstrated so convincingly in his own work, the history of the colonial state is of crucial interest to the study of the modern state in general, and to the study of the independent nation-states of South Asia in particular, as colonialism is the context from which these states emerged, its forms of governance kept largely intact. Thus, I begin our time together with a historical perspective on colonial law in South Asia, one which suggests the challenges of thinking beyond security as our conference beckons us to do. The state-sanctioned killing of a man on the geographical fringes of Yemen has resonated with me in a particularly forceful way, as it echoes my current research on the history of law and violence on the geographical fringes of British India, in what are now Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas. British colonial officials viewed the northwest frontier as the gateway to India, the road by which previous empires had historically entered and conquered the subcontinent. They believed that the security of British India depended upon securing a strong military position on this vulnerable land frontier. Alternately using the carrots of accommodation and conciliation and the sticks of force and repression, they struggled for a century to establish dominance over a people who, to borrow James Scott's formulation, seem to have mastered the art of not being governed. Colonial cartography on the frontier consisted of a double border. The Durand Line, drawn in 1893, marked the external political boundary separating Afghanistan from British India. To its east lay an internal boundary, referred to as the administrative border, which separated what were called the settled districts from the tribal tracts. The cartographic distinction between the settled districts and the tribal tracts had a double meaning. On the one hand, the settled district was an area where a land survey and revenue assessment had been done and where taxes were collected. On the other hand, the internal border separating the settled districts from the tribal tracts was structured to mark the limits of law, order, and civilization. In colonial discourse, the frontier tribes, primarily ethnic Pashtuns, and the land they lived on were defined as organic elements of an inscrutable and slow-changing natural ecosystem. One British author wistfully observed, quote, "Hidden away in dark, inhospitable nullas, in still darker ravines, in lonely mountain passes, and on barren, wind-swept plains dwell a people, the human flotsam and jetsam of the past." This mountainous geography and the tough type of man it supposedly produced, savage, chivalrous, desperate, adventurous, alluring, wrote Lord Curzon, were seen to be the main obstacles to British influence. This discourse of frontier otherness extended beyond the linguistic realm to define what could and would be done to the colonial state to local people in ways that had serious and deadly implications. In the mid-19th century, the colonial government created a modern judicial machinery for all of British India, establishing a hierarchical system of law courts and a codified system of law to be applied equally, at least in theory, to all subjects on the subcontinent. However, the logic and rhetoric that defined colonial frontier policy rested on the assumption that exceptional circumstances demanded exceptional treatment, and the frontier was that quintessentially exceptional space. The Anglo-Indian codes were derided by British administrators as being unsuited to local conditions, which required a, quote, rough and ready procedure better adapted to this primitive space. Colonizing Europeans, according to historian Lauren Benton, viewed mountainous regions as spaces of political isolation, violence, and backwardness, requiring a certain kind and amount of law to match their lower level of civilizational development. Frontier officials who pressed the government of India for special frontier legislation applied this very logic, arguing that the man on the spot needed a freer hand, unconstrained by legal rules and technicalities. This was the 19th century colonial version of Goldsmith's argument that law depends on context. For what is here modern, rational, indispensable, a legal rule, there becomes a bothersome and dispensable technicality. Thus, at the very moment when a normative legal order was established for British India, a parallel legal system was created on the frontier, comprised of the Frontier Crimes Regulation, which remains the legal framework under which the Fatah territories are governed by the Pakistan government, and the Punjab Murderous Outrages Act. These laws vastly broaden the power of colonial officials, disposing of the legal niceties introduced into India by the British themselves, including due process, a written trial record, formal rules of evidence, the right to legal representation, the right to appeal one's conviction, and so forth. The Punjab Murderous Outrages Act forms the subject of my talk today. The frontier was brought within the ambit of colonial authority in 1849. By 1867, 16 Europeans had been killed or badly wounded in the region, prompting the official demand for special legislation. The violence directed against their own men and women fortified colonial ideas about the brutal and bloodthirsty nature of the local Pashtun population and strengthened Britain's resolve to teach the tribes a lesson of obedience. On February 28, 1866, Mrs. Ashton Brandreth, the wife of an English lieutenant in Kohat, was being carried by her servants in a jampan when a man approached and fired his pistol at such close range that Mrs. Brandreth's eyes, eyelashes, and hair were singed. The bullet passed across her collarbone and through the front of her neck, sparing Mrs. Brandreth serious injury. Her assailant, Sumad, was immediately apprehended and tried by the local magistrate. He confessed to the crime, claiming that, quote, "I came straight to Kohat to kill a European. I formed the design thinking it was a meritorious action, having heard it was a meritorious action from some mullahs of Tira some years ago, and thought I should achieve a name for myself by doing it." 3 days later, the trial proceedings were reviewed by the Peshawar Division Commissioner, J.R. Beecher, who convicted Sumad of attempted murder and causing hurt. In his judgment, Beecher remarked that, quote, "The fierce fanaticism directed against the lives of the ruling race of India is a special danger of this frontier, and one which requires to be taken into account in determining punishment. In my judgment, it is necessary to adopt more than ordinary measures to prevent an evil so great and so fraught with political consequences." In mid-19th century England, the notion of punishment being proportional to the crime worked to soften the severity of the bloody capital code. In mid-19th century colonial India, by contrast, the idea of proportional punishment sharpened the edge of the law, enhancing the penalties meted out to those who dared to threaten the lives of the ruling race. For attempting to murder a white woman, Beecher sentenced Sumad to death and hanged him the same day. In summarily ordering Sumad's execution, Beecher exceeded the maximum punishment allowed under the Indian Penal Code for attempted murder. The maximum punishment was transportation. He also exceeded his judicial authority by failing to request confirmation for the death sentence from the Punjab Chief Court. His actions were subsequently upheld and excused by the government of India. The Punjab government viewed the attack on Mrs. Brandreth as something more than an ordinary attempt at murder, and as this was the third attempt on a European committed on the frontier within the past year, they asked the government for special legislation to enable district officials to deal with such attacks, quote, "more severely and promptly than is authorized by the Indian Penal Code and the Code of Criminal Procedure." The Punjab Murderous Outrages Act, passed in 1867, gave frontier officials the power to summarily try and execute alleged fanatics who murdered or attempted to murder servants of the Queen or other persons on the spot in proceedings that exceeded their ordinary judicial authority. Magistrates were ordinarily restricted from trying offenses punishable with death, life imprisonment, or imprisonment exceeding 2 years. Under the Punjab Murderous Outrages Act, a new class of criminals, identified as fanatics, were deprived of the rights and procedures mandated by the ordinary law, including the right to legal counsel and the right to have a capital sentence confirmed by a higher tribunal. Not only could a fanatic be tried and executed on the same day, his property could be seized and his body disposed of as the government saw fit. The most common method of disposing of the corpses of executed fanatics in the 19th century was to burn them. The annihilation of the fanatic's corpse was a symbolic device of colonial justice designed to secure that the executed man could not achieve the eternal martyrdom he supposedly sought. In this instance, British legislators used their knowledge of Muslim religious beliefs to enhance the force of the law, as they assumed that Muslims believed that a Muslim whose body was burnt after death would be denied a place in paradise. The burning of bodies was meant to strike terror into would-be killers by taking the, quote, kick out of a people who otherwise seemed to have no fear of the state. The notion of a troubled frontier populated by turbulent tribes legitimized acts of violence and coercion committed by the British themselves against local communities. In the first 30 years of frontier rule, there were no less than 40 punitive expeditions in which entire villages, crops, and livestock were burned to the ground by colonial troops. These brutal military strategies were intended to project colonial power and to compel compliance through intimidation, as a swift and certain hand was supposedly the only thing such people understood. John Kay poetically expressed the logic of this policy when he wrote, quote, "We cannot rein wild horses with silken braids." Echoes of this view can certainly be heard in what Derek Gregory refers to as the colonial present. From the British perspective, the Northwest frontier was in a perpetual state of crisis. Some administrators described emergency as the normal condition of things in the region. Quote, "The frontier is always a powder magazine," one observed. And even at the cost of sacrificing the ideas of theoretical liberty, it is essential to keep the match away from the powder. Keeping the match away from the powder entailed tipping the balance between liberty and government completely in favor in executive power under laws such as the Murderous Outrages Act. The Northwest frontier offers a historical case study to consider Giorgio Agamben's state of exception, a paradigm of modern governance based on emergency without visible end. Achille Mbembe has provocatively extended Agamben's insights about the nature of the modern state to the colonial world, defining the colony as a state where the controls and guarantees of judicial order can be suspended, and where, according to Mbembe, the sovereign right to kill is not subject to any rule. According to Mbembe, the total control found in the colony was enabled by, quote, "the exercise of a power outside the law." There is no doubt that the colonial state on the Northwest frontier was, in Mbembe's chilling formulation, a terror formation. However, it would be inaccurate to state that colonial violence was exercised outside the law. To the contrary, frontier legislation was specifically designed to extend colonial authority within a legal framework. The Murderous Outrages Act was a special regulation designed for a special space overrun with murderous fanatics determined to kill servants of the Queen. It provided the colonial sovereign with virtually unbridled authority over the colonized subject, including the right to summarily try and execute a person in unrecorded proceedings where the accused had no right to legal representation or appeal. But the sovereign's right to kill did not operate outside the law, for the law expressly provided for such killings, borrowing Goldsmith's language as the context demanded. The Murderous Outrages Act reveals the colonial state as a state of terror, even as it defined itself as a state against terror, controlling a supposedly ungovernable and fanatical people who could literally be disposed of as the government saw fit. In the colonial world, emergency powers were a constant feature of governance rather than a provisional response to temporary conditions. Anne Stoller has aptly described imperial formations as polities where exceptions are a norm. In colonial India, where the balance between state power and personal liberty was consistently weighted towards the sovereign in a way that was not possible for sustained periods of time in Britain, one finds zones of varying degrees of exclusion and suspended rights within the same broad territorial framework. The Indian and most of India had fewer basic rights than the Briton did. The Indian on the Northwest frontier was denied what Hannah Arendt calls a right to have rights under the parallel system of frontier legislation. The pervasive legalism in the British Empire, the notion that colonial power and legitimacy rested on a rule of and by law, required ways of securing control within a legal framework. The post-colonial states of South Asia have largely retained the laws and legal institutions created by their former colonial masters, including the extraordinary regulations that legalized the state's extraordinary use of force and coercion. Hence, I ask you, how are we able to think beyond security? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Yasmin.
Thank you. I want to thank the organizers for inviting us to this conference, and most of all for making it a Bangladesh-Pakistan conference, which is rather unique not to have India butting in between. And particularly given that I'm an Assamese, I had to make that, yes. I take this as an entry point from actually another piece of article that I read by Ranajit Guha on Not Home in the Empire, where he uses Orwell's story of questioning the possibility of freedom. Are we really free to act beyond the institutions that control us? Taking that as my entry point, I ask about the legacy of 1971, and is it possible to move beyond the narrative that has been created both in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India about a story of violence and hate? Rather, I search for a possible place of freedom on the platform of humanity, insaniyat, in South Asia. Like Orwell, the survivors of 1971 ask, will we seize the opportunity of recognizing our insaniyat and act as free agents for rewriting the narrative of the war? Can we break the cycle of hate produced and deployed by those in power? These questions of survivors allow a different and unique narrative to emerge, shifting the focus from external institution and state actors to the internal domain of people's memories preserved by individuals. The new and humanistic narrative of survivors is at the heart of my paper. Survivors' narrative from Pakistan and Bangladesh produce, in the word of Abdullahi An-Naim, a kinder, gentler story based on the understanding of humanity for imagining a better future in the region. This approach is particularly situated with the ongoing conversation of justice that is going on in Bangladesh under the War Criminals Tribunal. This is, of course, a different reading from that. The presentation is divided into two sections, and I'll very briefly go through both of them. One is the concept of stranger. The stranger, which is very different in the Islamic concept, which is based on ummah. The stranger is a guest. However, in the case of Pakistan, the stranger became the enemy. The enemy was identified as a Bengali body against which violence was allowed. Taking that narrative as, again, a beginning point coming out of survivors of 1971, I highlight the Islamic principle of repentance, tawbah, that many of the perpetrators spoke about, and ask for forgiveness and compassion, raham, that religion offers in order to reconstitute the principle of the rights of people, huquq al-ibad. To understand this Islamic concept, of course, one has to get into the question of insan, and I will not go into here. If you have questions, I can sort of talk about it further. This, I think, if we can return to the survivors' narrative that raised these questions of tawbah, insan, huquq al-ibad, I suggest it is a possible way to look for justice. Now, placing it within the context of the history of Pakistan pre-1971, I start the story with Ayub Khan in 1958, who soon after assuming the position of Pakistan, decided to look for ways how to create a narrative of the Pakistani people based on Islamic nationalism, because the only thing on which Pakistan are all united, as he said, was the fear of Hindu domination. Having established a common ground for Pakistanis to be a unified nation, he identified the army as the true protectors of Islam and nation. The Pakistani people and soldiers were encouraged to imagine themselves as the progeny of successful and fierce military heroes from Central Asia and Arabian Peninsula, and they were set in sharp contrast to the Hindu Baniya and sedentary agricultural class of peasants. The document titled Pakistani Nationalism was created by order of Ayub Khan to serve as a blueprint for Islamizing Pakistan. The document asserted that amongst the first settlers were the Arabs, and whose culture is still evident in the area of West Pakistan. However, the people of East Pakistan were seen to be closer to the Hindus of Bengal. Further, the document said that not only had the Muslims been the rulers and the Hindus the rule, but that they were diametrically opposed to one another. So you can imagine, by doing this kind of binary of Muslim in West Pakistan coming from Arabia versus the Bengalis as part of East Pakistan connected with India, closer to Hindu, the sedentary Baniya class, a real kind of division was created. It was accepted at the official level that the Hindu of the Hindu-like Muslim of East Pakistan had to be Islamized. And for this, another new version of history was written in 1965, again by orders of Ayub Khan, to make East Pakistan history a Muslim history. The group that, of course, was identified to be the biggest problem are the Muslim Bengalis of East Pakistan, because the language was viewed to be closer to Sanskrit, the food and clothes were deemed as not truly Islamic, and the people were considered to be susceptible to tremendous influence of West Bengal, particularly having communist inclination. The military's grand scheme of reducing the Bengalis into subject group, of course, flamed the fires of Bengali nationalism and provoked multiple unrest throughout East Pakistan in the 1960s. In an attempt to give Pakistan a new lease to life, Yahya Khan, as so many of you know, who became the martial law administrator after Ayub Khan, held election in 1970. And of course, this election, the results of the election were not accepted and led to the deployment of the army on March 25, 1971, under the so-called thing Operation Searchlight, to teach the Bengalis a lesson. At the end of the war, we know that Pakistan broke up into two, leading to West Pakistan becoming Pakistan, the truncated Pakistan that we know today, and East Pakistan emerging as Bangladesh. What appears to be the case in this particular instance is that linguistically and historically, from 1947 to 1971, there was a metamorphosis and shifting change of who is a Pakistani within Pakistan. The creation of West Pakistan as core concomitantly reduced East Pakistan into periphery, and the Bengali people morphed into the status of outsiders, aliens, Hindu-like, and ultimately became strangers in their own land. The Bengali stranger within Pakistan, deemed as enemy, deserved no consideration and goodwill, contrary to the concept of stranger as guest, was treated with kindness in the early Muslim polities. Pakistan's actions was thus inconsistent with its representation of itself as an Islamic republic. In turn, we also know that the Bengali majority in East Pakistan viewed the Pakistanis within East Pakistan, particularly the Urdu-speaking people, as their enemies. There was a proliferation of enemies. A common experience for everyone was the loss of honor and their sense of humanity. During my research in both Bangladesh and Pakistan, I discussed with a variety of people the problem of otherizing. I had over 250 interviews and conversations with Bengali and Urdu-speaking people, particularly women, and over 150 interviews with perpetrators in Pakistan and Bangladesh. Of course, this is not an exhaustive number, but the range that I covered in different areas, the area that I covered was quite extensive. Almost all the survivors I met spoke very remorsefully of the loss of religious and human values. I can't explain all of this in the short presentation, but I will very quickly tell two small stories. One is of a Hindu woman, Aparna, who was raped by her neighbors and Pakistani soldiers. And at the end of this event, of course, as she says, my life is not even like of a human being. Nobody has even recognized what I had suffered. This is not unique for a Bengali Hindu woman to say so, because even Bihari Muslim women today, even living in Bangladesh, talk about the inhumanity of women, of Urdu-speaking women's life in Bangladesh. Juxtaposed to this victim's narrative of dehumanization is a perpetrator's narrative from Pakistan, who also talks about how he joined the Pakistan army, and having joined the army, having been posted to East Pakistan, the crimes that he committed. He said that he recognized, even as he was doing the violence, that this was not what one human being does to another human being. As he sort of concluded in one short meeting that I had in the first time, he said insaniyat had died. But then thereafter, he had become a POW, and in the POW camp, he had an opportunity to revisit the violence that he and others committed. And in his cell, there were 36 men. And he said, when we started talking about it, we realized we had committed guna. And having committed guna, we had to do tawbah. But tawbah is not enough because, again, as he said, insaniyat had died. One may evaluate the Pakistani statement, the Pakistani soldier statement, as a cop-out mechanism to come to terms with the past without having to deal with the victim's suffering. This would be a hasty conclusion. To understand what this soldier is conveying, one has to place into context the Islamic concept of guna, committed against another human being. It is considered to be the most heinous crime that even God cannot pardon unless the perpetrator is forgiven by the victim. The admission by the soldier perpetrator that his action in Bengal constituted guna is significant because he takes responsibility and becomes aware that he has to bear the consequences in this life and in the hereafter. This realization, of course, does not come easy. His awareness of his fragile insaniyat makes him even more vulnerable. He has to live with the knowledge and in an indeterminate state because gunah and insaniyat cannot be redeemed without the victim's forgiveness. This is not just the only person. As I said, I had spoken to over 150 perpetrators, and very quickly I will give you a couple of names because they had allowed me to share this with you. One is Ikram Sehgal, very well known, and he said that in 1971 he could not take sides in the war because it meant dividing up his parents. One parent came from East Pakistan, and the other parent was from West Pakistan, from Sialkot. He said he was actually court-martialed for his dubious allegiance. Others like Sahibzada Yaqub Khan, Karar Ali Aga, Nadir Ali Masood Mufti, Muhammad Shafiq, Zahid Zaman, Riyaz Shipra, Syed Abu Nasir, Samsuddin, and others gave a great importance to the issue of conscience, zamir, in choosing to question the violence that they had committed during the war. Now, having collected all these testimonies from people who go back and forth between remembering the war as something that was duty and then recognizing it was violence and now asking for a different voice of humanity, of insaniyat, what do we do with it? That is the big question. Bangladesh's response has been to come up with something called a war criminals tribunal. In Pakistan, of course, there is a total silence about this issue, and perhaps writing about these issues may bring to light some of the things that they want to talk about, because perpetrators in their silent minds do talk about it, or talk about it in their minds, but have never verbalized it. So taking into consideration that both Bangladesh and Pakistan are Muslim majority countries, I would like to suggest, as I said, using the term insaniyat, that they bring it to the discussion as a possible place to start thinking what can we do as far as reconciliation for justice. Traditionally speaking, in Islam, there are two kinds of rights: the rights of God, hukukul Allah, and the rights of people, hukukul ibad. The hukukul ibad rights are basically secular rights that are unconditional and fundamental and cannot be denied to any person. Rape, that was a crime committed by men against women, is a matter of hukukul ibad. In the pre-Islamic cultures, the reaction to rape was retaliatory violence. But in Islam, it says it should be proportionate violence so that justice is restored. To reduce the severity of retributive punishment, people are encouraged to show mercy and compassion, raham. A rape victim's mercy to the perpetrator, 5 minutes? Yeah, is based on an active process of seeking forgiveness by the victim and the victim showing raham towards the victimizer. This is not very different from the Christian concept of forgiveness to some extent, but in the Islamic case, the right is given to people, not to some institution. It is also encourages victims and perpetrators to see one another as people, which is not very different again from the Gandhian concept of approaching British colonial policies and asking it to be redeemed rather than blaming the English as a community of oppressors. So Islamic restorative justice assumes that peace is possible after violence with a reciprocation of forgiveness, which the victim's right to give or withhold. Of course, it has to come from the victimizers themselves. The holistic approach has to come from the victimizer. In Pakistan, an effort was made by the Women's Action Forum to apologize on behalf of the Pakistani soldiers. But if we take the concept of hukuk al-ibad, it cannot be done on behalf of someone else. It has to be done by the people who commit crimes. So beyond the individual's understanding of the crimes, the states of Pakistan and Bangladesh are ultimately responsible in encouraging men to fight and encouraging men to speak about the violence they had committed and take responsibility for the actions that they had done. At this juncture, it seems almost impossible because neither Bangladesh nor Pakistan are willing to talk about it. So even though you may have a language, a cultural, religious language, to seek justice between victims and perpetrators, it has not yet come to a point where one can discuss about it. As a historian, I think the beginning point is to write about these issues, create these narratives, and open the way for the nations and the states to talk about it. So I'm going to stop here.
Willem.
Like Yasmin, I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for including me in this conference, especially because conferences linking Pakistan and Bangladesh are extremely rare and, as Yasmin has just pointed out, need to be more frequent. The theme of this panel is nation-state Geographies, and Identities. I'll try to say a few words about all of these, taking my cue from Geographies. South Asians know only too well that past territorial manipulations cast huge shadows over the present. The subcontinent's modern history is characterized by a bewildering array of administrative reshuffles and realignments. Its territorial tree of life looks more like a thicket than a tree. How geographies affect identities is important. And yet, the connections between territorial manipulation and changing identities in South Asia have been studied very selectively. To what extent have identities resulted from territorial change? And to what extent have identity produced territorial change? We certainly lack an overview even for parts of the subcontinent. So what I will do here is a cursory examination of just one region, now known to us as Bangladesh and earlier as East Bengal and East Pakistan, and suggest some comparative possibilities. Contemporary Bangladesh is the geographical result of three main types of territorial manipulation. First, reallocation, in which territories moved from one administrative unit to another. This was a frequent occurrence, but perhaps the best known was the shift of the district of Sylhet from the province of Bengal to that of Assam in 1874, and its partial reallocation to Bengal in 1947. Second is exclusion, in which territories removed from general administrative practice and brought under special local rule. In Bangladesh, a good example are the Chittagong Hill Tracts, a district for which a special regulation was created in the year 1900, remnants of which are still in place. Another example was northern Mymensingh district, which was turned into a partially excluded area from 1936 to 1947, giving rise to identities that still play a role in local politics. And the third form of territorial manipulation is fissure, in which an administrative unit is split. For Bangladesh, the most important were the creation of the province of Eastern Bengal and Assam from 1905 to 1911, the breakup of colonial India, first into British Burma and British India in 1937, and then into the independent states of Pakistan and India in 1947, followed by the fissure of Pakistan into Bangladesh and a truncated Pakistan in 1971. Such reallocations, exclusions, and fissures shaped not only contemporary Bangladesh, but also Pakistan and India. And this experience makes them such a rich case for comparison. Three states that grew out of a single colony, they took different directions and thus are living proof of the connected but unpredictable nature of post-colonial trajectories. Bangladesh provides an especially instructive case. Its special interest lies in the fact that in significant ways it has moved beyond the issues that still have such a powerful hold on Pakistan and India. Bangladesh has moved further away from the trauma of partition than the other parts of erstwhile British India. Yes, it took another huge trauma to make this possible. The game changer was the Liberation War of 1971. It turned Bangladesh into a society beyond partition logic, the logic of homelands for Muslim and non-Muslim South Asians. And because it is no longer grounded in that logic, its identity has been hard to define. Unlike Indians and Pakistanis, Bangladeshis do not really have markers like Kashmir to remind them almost daily of the pain of partition. This has made it easier for the memory to fade. But it is not just that the partition of 47 has been superseded by the partition of 71, and that the older trauma has faded. It is also that in Bangladesh, the events of 1947 have become a very inconvenient truth. The memory of an erroneous choice, a forced marriage, a dream turned into a nightmare. In Bangladesh, therefore, 47 is actively forgotten. It has been consciously erased. This presents a major contrast with Pakistan and India. Both Pakistan and India continue to celebrate partition and to legitimize themselves by referring to it. Bangladesh never does. The War of 71, which freed Bangladesh from West Pakistani control, also freed it from the Manichaeism that still haunts India-Pakistan relations. Seen from post-71 Bangladesh, South Asia provides a three-cornered game in terms of strategic alliances as well as identities, and the spell of 47 has been broken. In this sense, Bangladesh is the one that got away. Therefore, trying to understand contemporary Bangladesh by applying the standard tools of Indo-Pakistan scholarship is unhelpful, just as unhelpful as the practice among some South Asia scholars of overlooking Bangladesh when making general pronouncements about the region. Because it refracts the light slightly differently, Bangladesh exemplifies the comparative possibilities within South Asian studies. Let me give a few brief examples. Narratives of decolonization. The complexity of South Asian stories of emancipation varies. Put crudely, the Indian case is relatively simple and straightforward, a classical story of struggle against European colonial rulers. The Pakistani case adds a layer. It is a story of liberation from both European rule and Hindu dominance, occurring at the same time. And the Bangladeshi case adds yet another layer. It is the story of triple emancipation from European rule and Hindu domination, occurring at the same time, and from Muslim domination, occurring later. Even this third event is understood as a story of decolonization because Bangladesh historians insist on analyzing the 24-year period of united Pakistan as a period of colonial rule. A second example is phases of nationalism. Given the different narratives of emancipation, it stands to reason that Bangladeshi nationalism developed very differently from Indian and Pakistani nationalism. There are people alive in Bangladesh who still remember feeling part of the Indian nation as envisaged by the likes of Gandhi and Nehru in the 1940s, then learning to be a Pakistani, and now being a member of the Bangladeshi nation. Their experience of what you could call serial unlearning of previous national belongings links up with the experience of elderly Pakistanis, but contrasts with that of Indians. It remains largely unexplored. The development of Bangladeshi nationalism preceded the creation of the state of Bangladesh. It was an example of an identity creating a territory. It shows two distinct phases. From roughly 1965 to 1975 was a period of strident nationalism, based on ethnic pride expressed in symbols such as the Bengali language and the utopia of a golden Bengal. It was informed by a prominent transnational trend of the time, state socialism, yet within a capitalist context. It was directed against West Pakistan and after liberation in 71 against Pakistan, the United Nations, and China. The second phase began in 1975 and continues today. It can be described as instrumental nationalism. It has toned down the rhetoric of the earlier phase while still employing many of its symbols. It has moved firmly away from socialist models and has rediscovered its Islamic identity. It is also more distrustful of India without getting close to Pakistan. Linked to this is the third example about shifting cultural orientations. The creation of new national cultures, Indian and Pakistani, after 1947, led to a serious rethinking of cultural connections in East Pakistan. The 50s and 60s saw the emergence of what Columbia University scholar Ronak Jahan has called a vernacular elite. These people were Bengali-speaking, Bengali-schooled, had mostly small-town backgrounds, and were culturally East Bengali. They were quite distinct from the Bhadralok cultural elite that had dominated pre-47 Bengal, most of whom had left the country and were now in Calcutta. East Pakistan's vernacular elite consciously distanced itself from Calcutta cultural models, as well as from the West Pakistani and Urdu models that were being propagated by the Pakistan state. The Bengali language movement that emerged was not only emancipatory with regard to West Pakistani models, but also with regard to the Calcutta model. For the elite of East Pakistan, the focal point of Bengaliness shifted away from West Bengal. Calcutta faded, and its models, opinions, pronunciation, and politics became less relevant. The rise of strident nationalism in the 60s highlighted the East Bengali character of the language movement. It was a Bengaliness that was proudly Dhaka-centric, a trend that strengthened further after Bangladesh became an independent state. Bangladesh's trajectory of elite formation provides an instructive contrast with India and Pakistan. As a case of triple elimination, it is more complex than either of them. 47 saw East Pakistan's mainly Hindu elite decimated, being replaced largely by a new West Pakistani elite. 71, in turn, saw the wholesale retreat of this elite from East Bengal. At the same time, the rising vernacular elite was ravaged by targeted killings. Thus, Bangladesh was born with a tiny privileged group that had little experience of statecraft and international affairs. Post-71, lavish development aid allowed the meteoric rise of a new elite, closely linking state, NGOs, and foreign donors. The first decade of the 21st century saw the power base of this aid elite erode as other sources of power became available: trade, industry, and remittances. Complicated mergers between these groups have today created an infighting national elite without deep historical roots, quite unlike its counterparts in Pakistan and India. A final example is state institutions. In Bangladesh, state institutions also provide an interesting base for comparison with Pakistan and India. The joint origins in a fairly unified colonial system are still visible in terms of both form and bureaucratic culture. But marked differences have also appeared. It is no surprise that Bangladesh resembles Pakistan more than India, because India went its own way after 47, whilst East and West Pakistan went through similar processes of institutional change till 71. But after that, Bangladesh followed its own course, combining colonial legacies and Pakistan-era innovations with new policies and institutions. It is instructive to compare these. Think of the position of the judiciary and the armed forces, the systems of public education, the institutions of local representation, or consider the very different approaches these three countries developed towards their ethnic minorities, or more specifically, minority areas that were put under special regulations and sometimes special ministries. For example, Pakistan's FATA, or federally administered tribal areas, we just heard about them in an earlier phase, Bangladesh's Chittagong Hill Tracts, and India's Northeast. The divergent solutions that these states sought for rather similar problems of managing cultural plurality show how little these were determined by the joint colonial mold from which they emerged. All of this certainly has something to do with the conference theme, beyond security, but let me conclude with another aspect of the link between geographies and identities that relates even more directly to security concerns. Territorial conditions continue to have a strong impact on Bangladeshi identities because the country is territorially compromised. In many places, it has not been able to establish where its borders with neighboring India and Bangladesh are located. Nothing is more unnerving to a modern state than not being able to define the limits of your neighbor's territorial control. These border uncertainties are rooted largely in a shoddily executed partition in 1947 and have festered ever since. Of course, over the years, many attempts have been made to resolve the issues, sometimes successfully, but several major disagreements remain. India and East Pakistan, Bangladesh, can look back on a number of unimplemented agreements at prime ministerial level, notably the Noon-Nehru Agreement of '58 and the Mujib-Indira Agreement of '74. Just a few weeks ago, a similar agreement was made between Sheikh Hasina and Manmohan Singh. It will be interesting to see if this new round of reallocation, exclusion, and fissure can be implemented. If it can, however, it will not cover a number of key security issues. For example, the maritime boundaries of the two countries, which, as you may know, are currently a case in the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. Being territorially compromised is a condition that Bangladesh shares with India and Pakistan. These states' frayed edges affect their behavior towards their own citizens as well as towards those of the neighboring states, create defensive national identities, and heighten security angst. In Bangladesh, territorial uncertainty and resulting frequent border clashes and killings have had a strong impact on identity formation vis-à-vis India. In its more moderate forms, Bangladeshiness today is proudly non-Indian. In its more outspoken forms, it is fiercely anti-Indian. In Bangladesh, each border confrontation acts as a reminder of the fragility and insecurity of the national. Beyond this, identities in Bangladesh are anything but homogeneous or static. It may be helpful to think of them as kaleidoscopic. Just as the slightest movement of a kaleidoscope produces a new configuration of brightly colored bits of glass, identities in Bangladesh have a tendency to reconfigure in sudden, surprising, but apparently patterned ways. In recent years, the most brightly colored pieces in the mix have been of various types. The strident and industrial nationalism, ideas of Islamic decency, justice, and order, identities within the larger category of Bengali, whether Sylheti or Chittagonian, or Hindu or Christian, and identities beyond that category, the rights of ethnic minorities ranging from indigenous populations to Urdu-speaking stranded Pakistanis. And finally, transnational identities linked to cyber connectivity, diasporic Bangladeshi communities, and environmental concerns. The people in charge of the Bangladesh state have found themselves on shaky ground. Even after 40 years of the state elite feels relatively fragile compared to its Indian and Pakistani counterparts, often disunited and pulled in different directions by kaleidoscopic identity changes in society. Although a sense of national identity has flourished, internally it remains sharply fractured and the object of intense public controversy. This kaleidoscopic intensity sets Bangladesh society apart from both Pakistan and India. As a result, the Pakistan state has found it much more difficult than the Bangladesh state has found it much more difficult than Pakistan and India to be effective in projecting a stable vision of the nation and its security. In this brief presentation, I have touched on the geographical uncertainties that contribute to security angst and hiding behind national frameworks. These result in worrying erasures. For example, there are still historians of Pakistan who erase East Pakistan from their analyses. Such deliberate blindness is similar to that of scholars of Bangladesh who reduced the 24-year Pakistan experience to merely a demonic prelude to independence. More comparative approaches are beginning to emerge, but they need far more support and teamwork than has been possible so far. This conference could be the start of such a bigger effort. Thank you.
Well, thanks to wonderfully self-disciplined presenters, we have at least 20 minutes, probably a little longer, for discussion. So, floor is open. Yes.
Could you ask them to introduce themselves?
Yeah. Could you also introduce yourself briefly, just your name?
My name is Shirin Amanpour. Thank the panelists for very informative presentations. I was wondering if each panelist, I think so, but
Yeah, it's okay.
It's okay.
thank you. If you can perhaps in one or two sentences elaborate on what you see as the main issues now in Pakistan and Bangladesh. If you have to pick one or two issues that they're dealing with today that need to be reconciled for the security issue and for them as a nation going forward, what would those be, perhaps?
Could we pull together a few questions and then you can, yeah, maybe. So, if there are others. Yes.
My name is Geeta Sehgal. Thank you for all your presentations. I actually had comments come questions for all of you. And going backwards, I was a little surprised by your designation of Bangladesh as not having, I may have got it wrong, but a sort of secure sense of security or a sense of a nation because of these border disputes and so on. There are many measures talking about security on which you might say Bangladesh has done extraordinarily well. As you said, in terms of the money that's gone in for development, maternal mortality, and there are a lot of issues in terms of human security in which Bangladesh is doing rather better than all of its neighbors. And in relation to that, I would say that some of the comments you made about partition, I think you're absolutely right that the experience of partition in Bangladesh has been largely erased. But I don't know of partition being celebrated in India, and I'd be surprised if it's celebrated in Pakistan. I think independence is celebrated, and partition is commemorated or mourned, certainly in India, and I think that we have to make a distinction between the two. With Yasmin, I was fascinated by your account of interviewing perpetrators from the Pakistani side, and the sense of repentance and all of that. But don't you think that one of the ways of bringing together a narrative is not going to come from states, but from people recognizing this, and that actually something like the War Crimes Tribunal could be a forum in which Pakistanis who are willing to speak out about it with the work you've done, if they spoke, that would be a very important national narrative that actually came from people. And to Elizabeth, your description of the frontier regulations and the state of exceptionalism of the frontier was fascinating. But the question that I want to ask is that what disturbs me in having been part of the anti-war movement and so on in the West is the way in which this state of exceptionalism is in fact reinforced by the discourses of people who are opposed to the interventions and so on. So while there's a very strong discourse which says that precisely that Afghanistan is ungovernable, the frontier is ungovernable. Imran Khan, standing as a for presidential candidate, is promising to keep the parallel legal systems, as in return for security. No jihad, but keep your own systems. And there have been democratic movements from the ground that are demanding removal of that. So I think it's very dangerous when Western movements who think they're supporting people in facing the war on terror actually reinforce some of these discourses of exceptionalism and lack of interest in democratic rights. And I wondered what your comment was on that. Thank you.
Akbar.
Thank you. I'm Akbar Zaidi. I have a question for Yasmin, a couple of questions. One is that your caricature of the Bengali Muslims, which you said Ayub was responsible for, I think that predates Ayub by at least 120 years. This whole idea of how North Indians, Muslims saw themselves to be superior to any other Muslim in South Asia. And so that itself is an interesting way of how wrong East Pakistan was in some ways, how it created that. So I was just wondering, it's not right to blame Ayub, or you should blame him for lots of other things, but maybe not for seeing the way and the West Pakistani people and everybody else as seeing Bengali Muslims as inferior. I think that's something that is part of North Indian Muslim tradition. Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan being, I think, very vocal about it. The second question is about this idea of insaniyat and repentance. Does it have to be in an Islamic paradigm? I mean, does Rahm, Tawbah, Gunah, is there a way of repenting without turning to God and seeking forgiveness without, you make the distinction between hukukul ibad and hukukul, God and the world. But I think even your references to individuals looking at other individuals as symbols for repentance seem to be very Islamic or Muslim. But I'm sure there are other ways to repent.
Who's next? Dina?
It's a question for Willem about elite formation and Bengali nationalism. I thought that you perhaps overstated the rejection of a relationship between Bangladesh and West Bengaliness. And I think it seems to me that there's something at the core of Bengali Bangladeshi nationalism, that there's a real ambivalence and contradiction about what it means to be a Bengali, that actually haunts the political system entirely, as well as all of the cultural politics. And it really is about why we have a state that's a Bengali state for Bengalis, but it's not part of West Bengal. I think that there's this cartographic anxiety is beyond sort of with the Cheat Mahals and all of these other territories. And while there are a lot of people who want to be Bangladeshis as well as Bengalis, there is this supposedly progressive Bengali cultural and nationalist movement that wants to see itself as part of a larger Indian Bangladeshi thing, and I wonder if you could speak to that.
Shall we stop here and then go take another round?
That'd be great. Yes.
Okay, please respond, and then we'll take a second round.
But do you want to read first with Amanpour's question? Should I
Uh, Okay.
Willem, do you want to?
Why don't we start from
Yeah,
the beginning?
You start in the middle. How about that?
Okay, I'll start in the middle. It's a good position. Your first question about what are the common, perhaps, issues that can be addressed in a very short way. In the case of Pakistan and Bangladesh, both of them I see are going through major Islamization process of a rather violent kind, which is in a way putting women once again out of that conversation. So that's one of a common problem I see actually in both those places. The actors are different, but of course, and the methods are a little different, but they are common. And I think because it's common, but it is disconnected, they are not connected, these movements. They probably have networks, I don't know. They talk about all of those issues in American foreign politics. I'm not one of those to learn a lot about it. So I think the disconnect is also creating an indifference as if they are national problems rather than they're regional issues that we have to deal with. That's one of, or two ways that I see are common yet disconnected. Do you want to take that, the question and answer? To respond to that?
Just do the other.
Okay. then maybe I'll take all my questions
Yeah,
together
do that,
and
do
answer
that,
all of
yeah.
them together.
Yeah.
The question about I think Akbar's question and Geeta's question here about WCT and why am I bringing a vocabulary based on religion to sort of talk about 1971 are both connected issues. One is multiple issues for multiple reasons. One is this language comes out from my own the interviews and the discussions I had. I didn't make this up in Saniyat or Raham and Toba, not my words. They are not my vocabulary. This vocabulary was used almost by all Urdu speakers, whether it was in Pakistan or Bangladesh, okay, in different ways. They didn't invoke God. And here, as I said, God is out of the story. The concept of gunah is not a concept that is done against God. It is done against people. And that's what people reminded me over and over again, that unless our countries allow us to speak about it, it remains our individual problem. And that individual problem is something that they're interrogating. Why should it be our internal problem, our individual problem, where the nation and state had called upon us to do these acts or has used us as a body? Okay, so the language comes from there, and I am using it, I'm perhaps highlighting it even more because I'm talking about two Muslim countries where Islamization has become of the violent kind. I'm turning it back using, as I said, Abdullahi an-Naim's work of a kinder, gentler Islam. Maybe this vocabulary coming from the people will resonate, okay? Why Ayub Khan? You ask. I am using Ayub Khan as my takeoff point because I'm starting the story after 1947. We can't go to Sir Syed and say if Sir Syed's writing about the Bengali as not yet ready for that education that he was talking about, is kind of always connecting Aligarh to Pakistan. Pakistan has its own trajectory, and Pakistan has to take responsibility of what it does. Ayub Khan's the issue of Ayub Khan that I am highlighting is because he actually constructed bodies like the Islamic Ideology, the Central Research Institute, where Fazlur Rahman was very importantly attached to the modernizing influence of Islam, creating a modern Islam. In order to create a modern Islam, history had to be rewritten. In that history, people had to be identified as Pakistanis or who have not yet become truly Pakistani. And that is what I'm emphasizing. I'm not blaming Ayub Khan. I'm sort of looking at history and how history has been written and rewritten to create a new narrative that Willem has talked about, that is post-47. India and Pakistan have had very different stories compared to Bangladesh. Can there be a people's kind of ways of talking, Geeta, that you asked? Yes, it would be possible, and that's what I am sort of forging. I'm trying to say that if people can talk to one another using the vocabulary that comes out from within their own work, perhaps a WCT not commissioned by the nation, not commissioned by the state, would be the way out. But as long as it remains confined to the national parameter, as it has been done in Bangladesh, and identifying only one group of people as perpetrator, i.e., in this case, Jamaat-e-Islami people of Pakistani sometimes connection, and not using the multiple voices, perhaps. And is Pakistan yet ready? The women have talked about it, not the others. So, in fact, it was very interesting. I'll just give you one little anecdote. When I started the research in Pakistan, I went to Punjab University and met with the graduate students. They had never even heard that 71 was so brutal. So it is necessary to bring it back to textbooks. It's necessary to create the discourse that had been completely eliminated. Then you can have a people-to-people dialogue.
Willem?
Yeah, maybe to continue about the question about security. I think your point was very good. We have to be clear what we're talking about when we are at a conference called Beyond Security. I was really talking about security in the sense of the security community, sort of the political, military type of security. You were talking about human security, which, of course, is another type. And in that, you're right, Bangladesh has made enormous advances over the last 40 years. But what I was trying to do is show possible themes for comparison, for doing comparative studies of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. And I do feel that the sense of security in the political military sense in Bangladesh is different from India and Pakistan. That first of all, Bangladesh doesn't have nuclear devices, and the other two do. Bangladesh is, many Bangladeshis see themselves as inhabitants of a small country surrounded by a much bigger one, again, a worry. So when you look at security awareness, I do think there's a difference in Bangladesh, and I was trying to sort of flag that up. As to Bengaliness and Bangladeshiness, that of course is the big debate in Bangladesh. Again, I was trying to see if there are comparative advantages. And for instance, you can think how this works in Punjabiness in Pakistan and India. Or I recently heard of a study of Garo-ness in Bangladesh and in India, and showing that the two communities of Garos have developed different identities. And I think it's undeniable that most Bangladeshis have developed a different identity from West Bengalis. And yet there are all kinds of links and connections. So I really just wanted to show that cultural reorientation is the outcome of geographical interventions, and that is an interesting theme to study.
Okay, so next round, I have one, please. Do you want to respond?
You can see.
I'm sorry. No, go. Why don't you?
I'm not entirely sure I understood your point about anti-war protesters and state of exception.
The point was this, that the discourse around Afghanistan now, for instance, and I'm not saying this in any way as a defense of anything the U.S. has done or other foreign powers in Afghanistan at the moment, but the anti-war discourse is also, and in fact, there's a coming together as the U.S. and Britain and so on is trying very hard to, declare victory and make an orderly retreat, although not, as the ambassador pointed out, not a complete retreat, and negotiate with the Taliban. The discourse on both sides, the anti-war side and the war side, as it were, is that the whole democracy project was a nonsense. Now, you might decide that, yes, a democracy project with bombs raining down on a country is a nonsense, but the kind of discourse is that actually democracy isn't suitable for Islamic countries from the anti-war side as well. Certainly where I come from in Britain, this is a very strong discourse. That people have their own systems. There's a defense of parallel legal systems and the parallelism of more new ones being set up by, for instance, the Taliban, as well as the ones that you talked about in terms of the Frontier Crimes Regulations Act. And yet there have been movements on the ground in Pakistan of people who are demanding that they actually are subjected to a system of law. So on the one hand, it may be protesting about drone attacks and so on, and that's kind of state of military exceptionalism. But also there's a demand from radicals and Democrats and so on for actually having laws and not tribal law being applied. So, and as I said, the presidential candidate Imran Khan is also trying to do deals and saying he'll protect tribal law because tribal law is the price of national security. Don't make war against the state, but you can have your own customs locally. So that's what I was talking about. And I find that the convergence of these two discourses, that should be fundamentally opposed to each other, is actually a very frightening convergence and leaves no space to actually support actual democratic movements on the ground, because it treats the military opposition to the US as the thing that the anti-war movement should be supporting. In other words, it's supporting another war party. It's not an anti-war movement.
I think my one comment on that would be, as we know from a lot of work on colonialism in British India, is that the notion of tribal law is itself a kind of colonial invention or reinvention. I mean, for example, the Jirga, which is the local tribunal that administers criminal justice in the tribal territories, is totally reinvented by the British under the Frontier Crimes Regulation. So the Jirgas didn't customarily determine guilt or innocence. They tended to broker kind of political alliances or deal with political conflict. And then under the British Frontier Crimes Regulation, the Jirga is transformed into this alternative tribunal that, when you look at the records, is actually meant to sort of form a complementary system with colonial law. In the colonial period, for example, cases would often be sent to Jirga when the district officer, the British officer, in the middle of the trial would realize there wasn't enough evidence under British colonial law to convict the accused. And so to secure some kind of conviction, they would send this case to Jirga. So Jirga is not some autonomous domain of tribal practice. Jirga itself is reinvented by colonial administrators who are seeking to stabilize colonial power in some fashion. Imran Khan, he's speaking in Colombia today or tomorrow. I haven't, right now, it's sort of, we should be there. But I'm not sure that Imran Khan is really a spokesperson for tribal people in Partha territories. So, yeah.
Okay, well, one more round of questions, and we have, you begin. There's one there, and Kanchan there.
Hi, my name is Amina Jamal, and I'm from Ryerson University in Toronto. I had a question for Yasmin. I just found your whole presentation very interesting because I lived through 71. I moved to Pakistan. And I've been going back to Bangladesh, and so that's just a little bit of history that I want to just flag here. What I found really interesting was your discussion of perpetrators and their understanding of their own sin, guna. And I understand the language that you use, that is the typical Urdu-speaking language, but what I found really what struck me was the contrast between those internalized states and their own understanding of their what they had done or their emotion compared to what's happening in Pakistan now, and also globally, and encouraged through scholarly work and a kind of construction of Islam which is more practice-based and scriptural-based. And I'm wondering if in your analysis, do you feel that the kind of Islam that has been constructed since the 1970s due to what we might call politicized Islam and supported by, of course, Saudi Arabia and the oil wealth and everything, does that not lessen the possibility of this kind of acceptance of an emotional state on the part of guilt or guna and tawbah on the part of individual soldiers? Is that also not one of the factors that might be preventing that from happening, even if there were individuals? And would that even be legitimized in both Bangladesh and Pakistan, were it to take place at the level of individual actors? Because we know that suicide bombing, for instance, is almost condoned by the kind of Islam that we are seeing in practice in Pakistan and elsewhere.
Yes.
Sorry, I had a rather long way to go. I'm David Lewis from London School of Economics. It's more a comment, really, than a question. Just while we're on the subject of geographies and identities and insecurity, we haven't really talked about environmental, natural elements of the geographies, and it seems to me a particularly interesting dimension, particularly of the ways in which historically, Bangladeshi identity, at least amongst outsiders, has been strongly informed by notions of environmental insecurity. And there have also, of course, now been all of the climate change issues and everything too that feed into that. And with also the history of, for example, flood control, efforts which have taken place in both East and West. And of course, with the floods in Pakistan recently, tremendous international attention. And I believe that the Bangladesh NGO BRAC even sent people to Pakistan to assist with flood relief. And it seems to me there might be some very interesting channels and linkages and things around those kinds of geographies which we should bring into the discussion.
And speak about the implications of the differences between both for the quality of democracy. Two differences that strike me in particular is you also have an elite in Pakistan based on trade and industry, but you have an elite in Pakistan that is perhaps more dependent on land than in Bangladesh. And you also have an elite in Pakistan that is maybe an older elite. By that I mean multiple generations, whereas in Bangladesh it is sometimes second generation, but very often first generation. And I just wondered if this is relevant at all for the quality of democracy in both countries, and if you could speak to that.
Could I throw in just one last question on using my privilege as chair? And this is actually connected. To connect Elizabeth's paper with Yasmin's. Because in Elizabeth's paper, the description you give of this condition of almost the normality of the state of exception, as it were, it's particularly relevant for the frontier, right? Where, in fact, something like tyranny can be carried out in accordance with the law, okay? But that's justified because the frontier is, as it were, a state that's fairly almost indistinguishable from a state of war. There's this kind of constant state of war there. And that rhetoric is very much present in the kind of extracts you quote. That's what I thought was interesting in terms of connecting this to Yasmin's argument, because in a situation of war, and what are the demands of justice, right? What is a crime in a condition of war? And these are, of course, questions that we are very concerned with now all over the world because of the new emphasis on the concepts such as crime against humanity, etc. Because if you think of and I completely agree with your emphasis that this is a language which is coming out of, as it were, ordinary language of ordinary people, right? Ideas of insaniyat, etc., guna. And the interesting problem here is that are they actually seeking a form of forgiveness, right, or reconciliation, mediated by the state? Or is it a notion where the state actually does not necessarily have any role to play? If the state has a role to play, then of course you have completely new kinds of concerns. If it's a crime, is there a punishment for it, right? Because the popular notion does not seem to have an idea of, the victim actually inflicting punishment. So that's the kind of concern that your presentation seems to raise. It's a complicated question, but yeah. Please, now, Elizabeth first.
The question is, what becomes of crime and war?
Yes, what I'm suggesting is that in your case, of course, it's a question of the state being fundamentally the actor. And what you have described in terms of these areas, even today in Pakistan, you seem to be suggesting that this is a concern of the state, largely. Okay? Because even there, you could presumably have the kinds of things that Yasmin is talking about. You could have killings and so on and so forth, but forgiveness, reconciliation, all kinds of things, where the state doesn't necessarily have anything to do, a role to play.
But then,
yeah.
I'm Sarah Hussain from Bangladesh. I just wanted to just add a little rider to your question, to both Elizabeth and Yasmin. I was kind of astounded by the absence of any discussion about justice and accountability, and as you said, the lack of any construction of what's going on in terms of crimes and offences and the response to that. And also kind of astounded by the absence of a discussion of what a victim's rights might be. The victim's perceptions of what may be possible may be constrained by a whole host of realities and experiences of justice being highly inaccessible. But you seem to reinforce the notion that justice is just not part of the discussion at all. particularly in your case, starting with Aulaki, not mentioning anything about the offenses or the allegations about Aulaki at all. Similarly, in the context of talking about war crimes in Bangladesh, I think it's important that you talked about context somehow being an excuse for saying rule of law is relative, but context is relevant. You can't talk about these things in abstracto. And in both your cases, I think what we didn't hear was the context in which the entire exercise against Aulaki was mounted, and we didn't hear the context about the kinds of war crimes and the campaigns for justice, not for reconciliation. I don't know of any campaign for reconciliation in Bangladesh, to be honest, never heard of it in 40 years, but I have heard of very strangled voices for justice, which are now finding some kind of outlet. So I'd just like a response from both of you now.
Well, I mean, in the Aulaki case, we don't exactly know what the allegations against him are, nor do we know what the evidence is supporting him. That's the point. It was a sort of state-authorized killing that we're told is followed secret proceedings and deliberations by the Obama administration. We don't know what those are. Likewise, in this case, I mean, some of the connections I see between my paper and Yasmin are around questions of history and memory. And in this work, I struggle with this notion of the fanatic as a colonial construction. Nobody identifies him or herself as a fanatic. So the fanatic becomes a figure in this law. And the problem is because there's no recordings of these proceedings, it can sometimes be hard to suss out exactly what happened, what were these different individuals who are lumped together under this kind of constructed category of fanatic thinking or feeling. And that's an old question that people who work on colonial knowledge struggle with, which is there a real reality that is opposed to this colonial construction? I mean, I think not. But on the other hand, in terms of questions of history and memory, the violence of the British state against people in this area is a living memory. For example, there's a very famous figure who some of you may have heard of, Pakistani's Ajab Khan Afridi, who he kidnaps, he kills a British woman, wife of an officer, in the 1920s and kidnaps her daughter and escapes into the hills and is initially branded a fanatic and pursued as such. But because he escapes British power, it becomes increasingly impossible to refer to him as a fanatic because he's not motivated by any kind of religious means. I won't get into that whole story. But the point about Ajab Khan Afridi is his memory of him as a local hero is quite strong. In Peshawar, there's statues about him. There's sort of conferences that celebrate his heroic resistance to British rule. But he forms a kind of exceptional figure. I'm using the word exception too much. But in a way, because he evades the violence of the state, we can attribute a little more subjectivity to him and understand a little bit better how he's remembered in the region. Now, as for the question of, I wrote down what becomes a crime in war, but that wasn't the question. Yeah. The question of it being a constant state of war on the frontier.
The relevant question is state and non-state. How what is
Yeah.
what your description is very much where the state is central.
Yeah.
Right? Are there processes, non-state forms of negotiation?
Well, my emphasis in this particular work is on Indians who kill British officers. So that's always seen by the state as an act against the state. The British in the region are also really taken by the notion that this is an inherently violent population. They estimate, when they first take control of Peshawar in 1849, they estimate that there's 1 murder per day. And Peshawar is seen as the capital, the sort of capital murder of India for most of the British period. And there's all kinds of different ways that the British attempt to control and lessen violence within Indian society, including this construction of the Dirgah system, which they hope is going to reduce tribal feuds and vendettas. But my point here is just to show how, violence within sort of tribal society is of concern, and there are efforts to control it. But it's the violence against the British officer that elicits this kind of wildly, exaggerated response.
Should I take? Okay. I'm going to take all those questions together. I think Partha's question about what is considered to be a crime during war, and your question, Sarah, about what kinds of crimes are committed, are very interesting when it comes out from the testimonies of the soldiers themselves. And one thing I do want to highlight here is when we are talking of this 1971 war, there is no one group or perpetrator. If it came out like as if only the Pakistanis were doing violence, I apologize. It is not the case. It has been done by all groups of people, so when we try to talk about a context, we have to take into crimes who is the victim. That is, I think, the biggest question that, as I think commentators now we have to ask. We cannot take sides with national questions and say only one group is a perpetrator, other is not. The question of state maybe is one of the relevant issues in there. The state of Pakistan did use its army. At that time, East Pakistan was part of Pakistan. It was not yet Bangladesh, right? So it was seen as secessionism, treason, which is also a crime against state. Now, when the soldiers recall this event, they do say that there was certain permissibility when you go to war. There are certain permissible crime, like reoccupying territory, the guerrillas who were destroying our tanks. They had taken the help of our enemy, India. That's kind of permissible violence because combatants fighting against combatants. When combatants are not fighting against combatants but using terror, it is considered to be a crime. And this crime is committed by men against women. At this period in time in history, rape is not yet considered to be a war crime. We know that. It happens only after the Bosnian War. So that crime now needs to be revisited. Can we retroactively use the case of 1971 as recording as a war crime, a crime against humanity, crime against women as rape? Is left to the lawyers, I suppose, to ask that question. Hamidur Rahman Commission did talk about it. It is not like Pakistan didn't talk about it. Pakistan talked about it. It was not made public. So people who have to deal with this issue, as we are raising, continues to be an internal struggle because the states have not recognized it. Is it possible to continue with this narrative, with the rising trend of, as you said, an Islamization that is very aggressive? Sometimes I have to ask that question myself with the attack on so many Sufi shrines in Pakistan, which I think some of this narrative comes out of that kind of syncretic tradition. Over and over again, people did talk about Zamir, conscience, my conscience, and all my interviews are based from 2004. So it's 30 years after the war that people are still able to talk about this. Partha's big question is, what is the state and the people here, and how do we see the role of the state in this particular case? It's a very, very complicated issue, actually, and I don't know how to answer it, except bring it out to the forefront to say there are multiple narratives of 1971. Which one are we willing to hear, and which are the ones that the state wants to hear? Tahira Mazhar Ali has been continuing the struggle for a very long time.
Willem?
Well, I think Janaki is going
Okay.
with worry, so maybe we should stop it.
Good, okay.
Do it over.
Thank you very much for good opening session.